All right, hello to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor, Joe Sparrow. And in this episode, we're very happy to be joined by Dan Runcie, founder of Trapital, which offers, via things like essays, podcasts, and newsletters, music business insight with a strong focus on the business of hip-hop. Dan says that hip-hop execs are now some of our most successful business leaders, and he gives them the coverage they deserve. It's a great conversation coming up just in a couple of minutes. Now, what is this Focus podcast? Well, as you may know, Music Ally provides an analysis-rich and contextual guide to the music business, and each of these Focus episodes looks at one meaningful music business angle at a time, just like this one, which is why we're welcoming Dan to the podcast. And this podcast is also going to be quick. It should take about the same amount of time in which Khaled Abdulaziz Al-Azhari could hypothetically tie 900 shoelaces in a bow. He tied 31 in 1 minute in 2009. And I guess if you have 16 pairs of shoes, you could have a crack at beating that record yourself. Anyway, now talking of knotty issues, the music industry, as you know, is a complex place. And the Trapital newsletter is one of those things that helps make sense of the business of hip-hop. And thus, here we have the editor of one music industry newsletter and podcast chatting to another. But wait, it's actually going to be a great and insightful conversation on the state of the world's pre-eminent genre, which is, of course, hip-hop. We talked to Dan not long after Trapital has published its first big report on the business and culture of hip-hop, and Dan has a lot of interesting things to say. He says how the narrow genre boundaries of hip-hop are hiding its actual size, scale, and success on an international basis, how hip-hop's billionaire leaders like Jay-Z are poised to become large-scale investors of tomorrow, and how their hip-hop roots might mean that these investors have a remit to do things differently than the incumbents. I told you it'd be interesting, and let's go over to Dan right now. Finally, after a little bit of time of trying to arrange this, Dan, it's Dan Runcie from Trapital joining us on the Focus podcast. Hi.
Joe, thanks for having me. Big fan of Music Ally. Honored to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And it all worked out perfectly, really, because we're going to talk about a big report you released recently. And this is obviously one of those sort of meta podcasts where one podcaster is joining another because, of course, alongside his work at Trapital, Dan publishes a really great podcast, folks. So please do listen to that as well. However, this will be an interesting podcast and not just an ego-polishing contest between two podcasters. Now, Dan, to start with, could you just give us a little bit of context? Explain, your personal background and what Trapital does, just to set the context for what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I'm the founder of Trapital. It is a research company that is focused on music, media, and culture, and specifically with the focus on hip hop. So we look at how the music companies, the artists themselves, and the brands that have really developed from the artist and also the business leaders in the space. What does it look like? What is the why and how behind the moves that they're making? How can we better understand the strategies that they're doing? How can we better understand some of the moves that are being made? Because if we do this well, then we not only continue to elevate the space, but we continue to see how we can really highlight and understand the moves that are being made by, in my opinion, some of the most influential business leaders that we have. We've seen so many artists such as Jay-Z or Rihanna or Beyonce become quite influential in business and in music and more. But for so many years, so much of the coverage on them was a bit more surface and wasn't necessarily focused on what they were doing, the same way that you would be able to read a Harvard Business Review or Wall Street Journal breakdown on a move by Jack Welch or Elon Musk or some other CEO. We're seeing the same thing happen. And if anything, you're seeing it even have more influence with some of these cultural leaders. So how can we better understand the moves that they're making in music and then how that can extend? So I look at this company and I look at the work that we do as an opportunity to elevate that, but also provide a critical analysis to empower the leaders in this space to help make the best decisions that they can.
Cool. And it is a really good read out there, folks. So I recommend you sign up and get Dan's emails. Now, as you said, Trapital is specifically interested in the business of hip hop. It's wider than that, but that's one of the core focuses of it and the associated genres with hip hop. And you recently published a really deep and fascinating report on various business and cultural trends within hip hop. So And it's a really sort of big report as well. So what, in your opinion, were some of the most interesting findings in that, sort of in relation to what you just said?
Yeah, thanks for that. So for those listening, we recently released the first ever Trapital Culture Report. This is our breakdown of the most important news, the most important topics, and the most important trends that are happening within music, within media, and how we could better understand what's going on in the future. And there's a few things that stuck out to me and stuck out to the team while we're putting this together. I first want to give a shout out as well to David Boyle and Simon Jacobs with Audience Strategies. They helped put a lot of work into this, but there are a few things that stuck out to this. One was in 2021, this was the first year that hip hop had seen a decline in its overall share of US recorded music revenue. So we did a lot of looking to say why. Why is that happening? And there's been a few reports from a few different publications about this, but we wanted to take a different angle with it. And there are a few big takeaways. One is honestly a lot of how we classify music that is coming specifically from different genres and different areas, because hip hop, at least the way that music has been categorized, has been a bit more focused on American hip hop, at least the way it's classified, even though you have artists like Ozuna and Bad Bunny that are making hip hop music, but in a different language, but it gets classified as Latin music instead. So if you couple that with the growth of streaming, especially internationally and globally in so many different countries, there can seem like there is a decline in hip hop, even though its overall recorded music itself is still continuing to grow from a raw number perspective. But the thing is, other genres like pop music, for example, don't necessarily get that same classification. An artist like Blackpink or an artist like even Harry Styles or Adele, it's still considered pop music. It's not as if Harry Styles is considered British, or it's not as if Blackpink is considered Korean. There's a bit of a classification thing there. And I think there's also some rule changes that influence how certain things get counted, such as album bundles and vinyl and who gets priority versus what, how those things have changed. So that's one of the trends that we started to see that really stuck out to us. Another one of the trends is investing specifically, and how a lot of the artists today are making a lot of their money. And one of the realities about the current state of the music industry, specifically with the artists that are doing the best, is that artists tend to become millionaires by selling their music, whether that's through Spotify or through the DSPs or going and performing their live shows. That's where they are able to at least develop that initial amount of money, but they often become billionaires by selling products or by investing in companies that sell products. So this always has been a little bit of a tension because, of course, the inherent value of music itself has become even more and more marginalized over time, just given the dynamics of music streaming and even some of the challenges we're starting to see now more so in touring, where in both of these cases, it's the artists at the top that are benefiting the most, but a lot of the artists in the middle or the long tail can struggle unless they have a bit more ownership over what they have. But you look at the names that are often the billionaires, or the names that are often doing the best. It's your folks, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's your Rihannas, your Jay-Z's, your Dr. Dre's, your Diddy's, or even someone like Burner. They are selling companies and selling products that are the company people are buying time and time again, but they're also leveraging the influence that they have over time. So that's another thing that we definitely saw that stuck out to us with the report. And I think the third thing that I think about specifically with the report is the trends of where things are going and what genres to look at next. I look at genre like Afro beats, and I think about the huge potential there, just given the music industry's investment in Africa and how there is so much activity there, even outside of music, on what's happening from an investment perspective. And if you just see the trends, streaming makes up a majority of the revenue for the music business. Streaming is much more saturated in the Western world than it is in other countries. So naturally, as it grows in those other countries, they'll be able to recoup even more of that revenue. And therefore, a lot of the artists from those regions will be able to thrive the same way that you've seen Latin music thrive. And with that, I think you'll also see more success stories from artists in their own local languages, artists being able to speak to their fans directly without needing to have imports from the US, without needing to speak in English or even have crossover music to collaborate in that same way. And I think it speaks to the globalization of music and this industry and of live entertainment as well, which is great. But I think it's going to shift what success looks like for a lot of artists that have been used to not just dominating in their local language countries, but being able to tour around the world. And I think that echoes a few of the things that you're starting to see more, where you're hearing a few more comments from major record label executives who believe that it's harder and harder to break new superstars. It's harder and harder for them to be able to continue to control the levers that they can to market and push artists to make sure they're successful. They're a bit more subject to TikTok. They're a bit more subject to algorithms and things like that that are out of their control. So I think you couple that with the international growth, what success looks like in fandom is going to continue to look very, very different over the years. So those are three of the things that stuck out to us with the report. There's a ton in there, but those were three of the biggest takeaways.
I mean, that's a lot of really interesting stuff there. And as you said, it sort of blends the business with the cultural status of hip hop, which of course has been the predominant pop music. It is, you know, we talk, you made a really interesting point there, which is the differentiation of genre. You know, hip hop and pop music, but actually it's clear that hip hop is the predominant form of pop music and has been for 20 years. I mean, like at least, right? And you know, let's touch on that first one then about this genre, the sort of genre boundaries. You made a really interesting point there about how perhaps hip hop is considered to be a US North American genre, and outside of that, well, it's Latin, or here in Germany, where I'm talking from Berlin, folks. There's a huge Deutschrap scene, which is German hip hop, which 5 years ago was tiny and it exploded organically, but it is again sort of boxed off in its own genre. And of course, Latin music is almost an archaic term because it covers so many different types of music, so many forms, cultures, from a huge part of the globe, right? So do you think that in purely in sort of being able to understand the business, do you think that there's perhaps a sort of a need for a better, I don't want to get into sort of talking about metadata, but a sort of a better classification of understanding what hip hop is and other genres as well?
100%. Huge opportunity to have better classification. I think you called it out yourself, right? I think someone like Bad Bunny has more in common with someone like Drake or Travis Scott than he probably has in common with Gloria Estefan, right? But the way that we classify the music would make it seem that there's a bit more alignment with someone else who is from Latin America. So I think that if there was an opportunity to classify the data that way, and a lot of this is just depending on how things are cut and sliced, because if you look at some of the trends that you're seeing, it's not just quote unquote hip hop music that is in decline. It's English speaking music in general isn't hitting the same way that it once was if you just look at the overall aggregate numbers because of the success that you're seeing across the world from other areas. But if other genres that include English speaking music like pop music or other genres as well are including non-English speaking or even artists from other countries as well, in Western Europe and other places, then it's going to shift how the data is looked at. I do think that it speaks to this overall thing where I think you mentioned this earlier, hip hop has been quite dominant for years now. And even though I think the stats that we see itself may imply that some of that has been lagging, I think it's been that way for quite some time, even though the shift may have just happened at the peak of, the peak growth phase of the streaming era. So I do think that there is an opportunity to likely have multiple classifications of things just so people can have a better understanding, because I was talking to a friend and this was a similar thing, I think, in the 90s when you would have a hip hop artist hop on a Mariah Carey song or hop on a collab there, and that would be considered pop music, even though it's the biggest song of the 90s, right? So there's things like that. But I do think that in the streaming era, you've seen this shift away from genres and people thinking more broadly about moods. I think people saw a lot of this with how even things like Spotify Wrapped and other things like that are classified. I don't think we'll necessarily ever end the classification of genre. I think there's so much rooted in the industry with how it's focused, but some of these terms have really held artists back. You even think about something like radio. I know radio has been quite in decline for some years now, but it's still a fairly steady revenue stream. And the difficulty that a hip hop artist could have of getting on pop radio, even though they have some of the biggest songs ever, is something that does limit their impact. So there's still some of these levers here where both distribution and classification can create a narrative that may not actually exist. And I think the fact that the barriers are lower than ever and control is no longer being tightly held by the people that once had it as much, you're starting to see some of these things come to light.
It was an interesting point you made there about mood playlists and sort of, on one hand, shifting away from genre. Everything is now a vibe, right? So the vibe shift is real. But then at the same time, there is something quite important, isn't there, about being able to say, I am a hip hop artist. It has cultural significance to say, oh, I am not this, I am this. So I'm saying that it's going to be quite interesting to see how that shakes out, because the artists want to be able to say, I am defined by, hip hop is in itself sort of an Uber brand. It sits over all of those things that you just mentioned. Like a lot of things in the world at the moment, there's a sort of reconfiguration of what that means. And we'll probably, like you say, maybe come to a more nuanced sort of solution at the end of it. There was one more thing you were saying there about artists, hip hop artists, the big ones, sort of turning their brands, speaking of brands, and leveraging them into bigger things, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a minute in more depth. But do you think there's ever a danger that an artist becomes too aligned with maybe the business side of things as opposed to the music? I mean, at what point is that balance out of balance, if you see what I mean?
I think about this two ways. One, you have people that are pushing, I'll break this up in two ways, pushing the business of the music itself and then pushing the business of the things that the music allows you to do, which is these other areas of business, right? So I'll tackle the first piece of it. Given the way that streaming is set up now and even touring to some extent, if you look at the past 2 decades of the music industry, and go back to 3 decades, the whole dynamic flipped in terms of how people thought about putting art out there and what that looked like. In the 90s, at the height of the CD era, everything was about selling CDs. Even going on tour, the thought was that, oh, this would be a great way to get people to buy more CDs, right? It was the high margin item. You wanted to get people to buy more in this. And now the post-Napster era, and now where things are with streaming, is completely flipped. People are putting their music out with the hope that they can sell a tour ticket, with the hope that they can get you to buy something down the road. So when the dynamic of it flipped to that extent, there's always going to be actors and ways that people will try to maximize revenue, or they'll try to get as much as they can from the business aspect of either recorded music or live entertainment more broadly. I think in the 90s, you saw this with whether it was double albums that didn't need to be double albums, or greatest hits albums when the artist didn't necessarily need to, or just having filler tracks on an album just because people knew that they would spend $20 to buy an album just because it had 2 or 3 songs they liked on it. Now, I think you've seen this flip in a few ways where it's streaming specifically. You'll have artists that are now going to release music more often because they know that it's about getting the clicks, getting the streams, and that's ultimately how they get compensated. So there are artists out there, especially, I think you see this even more so in hip hop, that are releasing albums every other month, or releasing some type of album, mixtape project every other month. And you're even starting to see this to some extent with the biggest artists in the world right now. It's no coincidence to me that Drake, Taylor Swift, and The Weeknd, 3 artists specifically who have all signed more favorable deals with their record labels, are releasing music now at a faster clip than they may have in, the earlier parts, in the mid parts of the 2010s, because they owned their rights and they owned their masters and other assets for at least anything that they're putting out in the future, and they're licensing it to these companies. So you're starting to see that, but I think you're starting to see it as well from the music side. So I think, to answer the question you had about what does this mean for the music itself, yeah, there are some artists that are going to be pushing that because they know they can get the streams up. But does that mean that the quality is less? Does that mean that they may not necessarily get as much as they may like? They or not as much as they may like, that the fans may not get that tight album that they may have wished they would have wanted. I think that's an unfortunate consequence of the way things are, but I don't think every artist necessarily applies to that, right? I still think that it feels like an artist like a Beyonce or even an Adele are more than willing to wait, still release every 3 or 4 years or however long it is, and you'll get that album that they'll elevate and hopefully can, stand the time, even though, if we're being honest, it's a bit antithetical to what some of their peers are doing elsewhere who are on other labels and doing their own thing. I think the second part of the question, though, which maybe was a bit more of where you're asking in terms of what artists are doing outside of music to the areas that they are generating more money, I think that Rihanna is probably an interesting example of this, right? Where we see this dynamic flip where when Rihanna was in her late teens and early 20s and even in her mid 20s, we had album year after year after year.
Yeah, she was the most regular releasing artist, wasn't she? Yeah.
I know,
year,
right?
Yeah.
It was like every year you knew you were going to get some, like summer anthem that was going to carry you through. But unfortunately so, during a lot of that time, she also had issues with her accountant, almost filed for bankruptcy. So even though we were getting the music, it wasn't all pretty for the business of Rihanna. A few business attempts, but not all of those didn't necessarily become what Fenty Beauty became. So it's no coincidence that she then, launches this successful company, $2 billion brands. She becomes a billionaire herself. And it's now, next month, January, will be 7 years since she released her last solo album. I know she's going to be performing at the Super Bowl, but she doesn't have to really record new music to do that. I know she did some stuff with the most recent Black Panther soundtrack, but you're starting to see that flip. So while the person who is, like me, a big fan of Rihanna's music up to this point, wishes that you would have heard more, given the dynamic of the industry, like she never would have been able to hit the points that she had hit, no matter how many albums she released and no matter how many times she went on tour, even if she, had upgraded to stadiums. So there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, yes, it's a very good point, which is she has, I mean, on one hand, you could say, well, I feel like I'm owed 7 albums because she hasn't released one for 7 years. But at the same time, if anything, her fame and brand has grown immeasurably in that time, because of all these parallel things, and it doesn't seem to have damaged her sort of connection with fans in any way. And in fact, it's almost like she's laid the ground with this huge catalogue of great songs, and people are happy to just go and mine the catalogue. A song from the past is as good as a song from today. Okay, and just to jump in here, if you're finding this useful and you'd like more of this in-depth news and trusted analysis waiting for you in your inbox every morning, as well as access to all of our industry-leading reports, head on over to musically.com/subscribe. And you, yes, you may be eligible for a free Music Ally subscription via our corporate and sponsored subscriptions. So if you work for a DSP, a major label, an indie label, or if you're an artist manager, an employee of a CMO or a publisher, you can check to see if it's available for you. It's musically.com/subscription-options. There's a link below the podcast to check out as well. Okay, let's go back to the interview. I just want to talk about that sort of very specific, and sort of to build on what you just said, that specific connection. Hip-hop and business success have always been very specifically closely interconnected. All the way from the very early days, and I'm sort of interested in why you think that is, because, for instance, we'll talk about the business success of rock stars and pop stars, but as a sort of separate thing, separate entity. They are the artists, and the business success is a consequence, even if they're doing similar things, launching brands or whatever. It's sort of this consequential thing, whereas it seems inherent in hip hop. And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's for a few reasons. I think that hip hop historically as a genre is something that was marginalized for quite some time. It took a lot of effort for these artists to establish a credibility to even get respected, even when they were selling as much as their counterparts in pop music and their counterparts in rock music, especially those artists who were not Black. And a lot of the artists who, in a lot of ways, from pop music and rock music, because they were less marginalized, the industry was more likely to work in their favor. So of course, there's examples of, where that isn't the case, but I think you start to see more of that innovation that often comes from those groups that are either marginalized or taken aback because they feel like ownership and being able to do things themselves is the way to be able to do it. I think it may seem kind of crazy now to look back, but Jay-Z had a tough time getting looked at and signed by a record label. He went and he tried to talk to them and he tried to pitch himself, but it just didn't work out in the way he wanted to. And that's why they started Rockefeller Records in the mid-90s. This was an opportunity to establish themselves. And then eventually over time, through what they built, they were able to gain the leverage to then get in those doors and then ultimately do things that were more favorable for them. It's not as if they, had some of the luxury as some of their other folks did. I think you saw this even to some extent with, women as well. Like I know Madonna, although, she's a white woman, her being able to start Maverick in the 90s was the thought of being able to eventually own the same thing, because I think she had seen some marginalization from how she was treated relative to some of the male pop stars or some of the male rock stars at the time. So I think that feeling like you've been either taken advantage of or not being given a fair deal, and the fact that so many artists grew up and heard so many of these stories over time. I think TLC in the 90s was one of the most famous ones of just artists feeling like, you heard your music everywhere, but you're still waiting years and years to be able to get what's theirs, even to more recent stories where Meek Mill had recently shared that in his first decade in music, he only made $11 million total. And you just think about like all of the things that he put out there and how long it's taken and how long it is. All of that puts you in a mode where it is you feel like it's more advantageous for you to go and build your own. And I think so much of that spans beyond music, just with how Black business is looked at and how the opportunity and how they're treated and how much of it is baked into, institutionalized racism and how that expands through. So much of that mentality sticks with the artist and you just hear more and more of it today. So the fact that I think now you're in this era where concepts like ownership and things like that are being talked about more and more, especially in hip hop. And I think even though you still do see it in other genres, I think you see it less in those other genres because there is a bit more of that inherent belief in privilege that the system is more likely to work in your favor if you don't look like, the way that a lot of these hip hop, and I'll extend that to R&B artists as well.
And one of the really striking things is how hip hop artists have been able to, they've been extremely historically aware of the leverage that they have, the power that they have, and have turned it into, they've been the first sort of global stars really to turn them into brands outside of music, to come up with extremely creative ways of signing deals to allow business deals that are also record deals, that are also branding deals, that are also merchandise deals. That, and this creativity has actually probably elevated the entire industry in all other areas as well. Let's talk about the sort of the very high end. You mentioned Jay-Z there. His life is an incredible story. His business life is an incredible story. We're not even talking about his music. He's got a venture fund which has invested in a number of companies over the last, 5 or 7 years, I think. You said in the report that it's a potential cultural shift in a sense, that you said that the culture can build its own Sequoias, Benchmarks, BlackRocks, and Carlyles, i.e. a fund like Jay-Z's can can join the large, powerful investors, which sounds completely possible. So if that's the case, and he's kind of on his way to doing that, is there a remit for people who started in that hip-hop, in that community and that mindset you just mentioned, to then reach that very sort of pinnacle of wealth and leverage and investment power? Do they have a remit to do things differently than the big incumbents at the moment? One example could be there's an investment strategy at the moment, ESG strategy, which is investing in companies that score highly on, for example, environmental social responsibility scales. Do you think that just as these artists have reinvented things and done things in a different way in the music business, they have a remit to do it elsewhere as well?
Yeah, I do. I think that going back to that last question too, I think that part of the feeling like you are coming from this background that has been marginalized. You didn't necessarily get the fair opportunities you did when you tried to do this yourself. If you then want to be the person that can control and call the shots and build the business the way you want to, you're likely going to try to correct for a lot of those things and address those challenges in what you end up building specifically. With that point that I made about Marcy Venture Partners, I think what makes Jay-Z's firm there and the team they work with a little bit different than a lot of the other investments is that they are leading investment rounds in relatively later stage companies. I think there was a Series A company that they led the round in, and I point that out because we have seen more and more hip hop artists become investors, which is great. But a lot of the investments they make are in the early stages where it's easier to get those small checks in there, right? It's easier to make the few $1,000s or even the tens of thousands or hundreds, or if you're even more established, tens of millions, like the way that we're seeing Jay-Z do with these. The thing is, though, in order for a lot of the early stage investments to get closer to being exits, whether that is a unit, whether that is going public or that is getting acquired, they do rely to some extent on later stage venture capital and private equity to be able to make that happen. But we do see less and less hip hop artists at that level. And that's why I mentioned the Sequoias and the BlackRocks and the Carlyles, because those are the PE and later stage VC firms, which do get much more involved in that later stages and really help those companies get from 60 to 100, essentially, if you're just thinking about 100 being a exit there. So I do think that over time, we likely will see this, but it's something that takes time, right? You see this manifest in other areas where a lot of artists will talk about how they would love to be able to own a professional sports team. And I think right now, in the past few years, I feel like every few months, there's another NBA or NFL team that gets announced that it's being up for sale. And most of the times there are buying groups that are involved, and there's a lot of the same names that we know are interested, whether it's Diddy or Jay-Z or Oprah or Stephen Curry and or LeBron James and others that want to own these teams. But while some of these people may be single digit billionaires, in order to be the, one of the, controlling and majority owners of a team, the net worth naturally does need to be even higher than that. So while we've seen a lot of the Black business leaders, especially in entertainment, reach that single digit billion dollar net worth levels, I think you do need more than that, because that's how much these teams are costing themselves in order to be purchased. So I think that's the way you see it manifest. So I think by the time you see that happen, you'll start to see more of these things where I think we see this, and you hear it all the time, where you hear about these professional sports teams, especially here in the US. I'm sure you probably see it over in Europe too, where the owners and the structures can tend to be a lot of people who don't have much in common, both, culturally and from how they may vote, how they may choose to see the world, with the teams and the players that are ultimately playing for those teams as well, right? So I think, going back to that remit question, if you are someone like a Jay-Z or if you are someone like an Oprah, you want to own one of these teams, you likely want to make those changes and put those implementations in yourself, whether that's who you hire to be a head coach, who you put in positions of leadership and things like that, because I think that factors back into things we hear about in the music industry as well, which is who's in power, who's the one making the decisions, which then ties back to why some of these artists may have felt marginalized in the first place.
Yeah, the key description you used there was business leaders, and Jay-Z now clearly is that, just because of the sheer volume of money and power and influence that he's built up. Beyonce as well. There's a whole bunch of people who've become hugely successful through music, and have the opportunity to make cultural changes with the power that they have. Let's look ahead a bit then to sort of wrap things up. What does the future look like for the business of hip hop? You've outlined it very well in this report. It's already huge, and it's globe spanning, and as you've alluded to, it's perhaps bigger than we think in terms of genre terminology. So, where does it go from here? What changes might we see, or what sort of features might we see of hip hop and business going forwards?
Yeah, I think we'll see changes both at the highest levels, but I think we'll see it at the smaller levels too. I think you're starting to see more and more. I'll start with the smaller level first. I think you're starting to see more and more artists who are being thoughtful about what ownership looks like, why they are choosing to either sign with a record label, why they may choose to want to own their rights. But I know a lot of those decisions are getting, easier said than done, because it's one thing to say a narrative that may get tons of likes and retweets or shares on social media. That's a clip about why ownership's important. But if the record labels are having a tough time getting exposure and breaking through when they have all the resources in the world to try to make that happen, whether it's on TikTok or getting you big interviews and stuff like that, then an independent artist is likely having just as much struggles, even more so because they're likely a bit more strapped on resources and money in general. So even though I think the mentality's there and that's ultimately what's there, that doesn't mean it's necessarily easy. So I do think you'll start to see more and more improvements there over time, but it does lend itself to artists really needing to make the decision for themselves of like, okay, if I'm signing to a record label, what am I specifically trying to get from them, just given that there are other options and there are other outlets that they can get. And I think it's becoming a bit more of this power law dynamic where if you are someone who wants to try to become the biggest star in the world, you want to headline Glastonbury, you want to perform at the Super Bowl, you want to, have the number one album of the year, I do think that being at a record label is likely going to become more and more of that, even more so the place to go if that is the ultimate goal. You're trying to reach the top. But if your goal is to have a successful career, you want to be able to manage things on your terms, there's so many more options now to be able to do that. Again, that doesn't mean it's easy, but there's just a bit more flexibility the way the system's set up now. At the largest levels, I think you will start to see, some of the big names that we've mentioned before, if they continue to reach and have success in their business ventures and the things that they've done, maybe they will continue to be able to reach those, higher goals themselves, whether that is them starting their own later stage PE or VC firms to be able to help, mark up and have the companies they want to succeed. And then maybe, some of them could reach any of those higher levels of success, whether that's owning a sports team or things like that, that I think, from at least a headlines perspective can signal that growth is still happening. So it's an exciting time. I'm really excited to see where things continue to go from here.
Well, that leads me on nicely to my the first of my final two questions, which is, if people want to follow that, then how do they subscribe to Trapital and hear all about it?
Yeah, so two things I'll say. If you're listening to this, you're probably a fan of podcasts, then you should definitely check out Trapital. We have a weekly podcast that goes out where I have conversations with some of the leading experts, moguls, artists themselves about what's happening right now in the music industry. That's Trapital, and you can subscribe to that wherever you get podcasts. For this report itself, you should go to Trapital's website, trapital.co, and we do have a link to the report there we'll make sure it's on the homepage so that you can then see it, download it, and check it out for yourself. And
what has reaction been like to it? I mean, I will put links to both of those things below the podcast, so you can click from right now, actually, as you're listening. But what has response been like to the report so far?
Yeah, the response has been great. The response, honestly, has been great. I think that it worked well because we were able to double down on what makes Trapital stand out and why I think it has resonated as much. There are plenty of other reports out there that'll just give a pure share of what the numbers are. But over the past 4+ years, people have been reading Trapital more so for the insights and the strategy breakdowns. So even though it hasn't necessarily been the sole place of sharing like numbers per se, this was a great opportunity for Trapital to be able to combine the numbers with the broader narrative, the way that we're seeing things, and being able to make sure that we're sharing things is as an objective way possible, but taking the inference and the insights together to really package something and make it tangible and actionable for the people in the space.
Yeah, great. An approach mirrored over here at Music Ally as well. So nice to align there. Okay, and one final thing then, Dan. This is a question I've been throwing in to most of my podcasts recently, which is, if you could only listen to one piece of music, it could be a song or an album. I'm going to keep it vague there, but if you could only take one release or piece of music, what would it be?
There's so many that it could take. Right now, I would probably, just given how much I'd listen to it and maybe what my Spotify Wrapped is telling me as well, Frank Ocean's Blonde. It's been 6 years at this point, but man, I really think that's one of those albums that still incredible, and I think we'll look back on the same way that I think people look back on albums from the 60s, 70s, and 80s about what past generations look at. I think that this current generation will look at that album the same way.
Yeah, you're the first person to suggest that one. But yes, I agree. It's definitely going to be one of those landmark ones forever, isn't it? Yeah, great choice. Okay, so Dan Runcie, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Joe. This is great. Thanks for having me. Again, great fan of all the work that you do and the team at Music Ally. Thank you.
And there we go. So if you found that useful, please share this podcast on with someone else who you think will also get something out of it. And if you'd like to email me and give me your thoughts, it's joe@musically.com. It's joe@musically.com. Don't forget, we have a free weekly email called The Knowledge, which rounds up a bit of this and a bit of that, of the best analysis, news, marketing, insight, and skills from Music Ally. There's a link below the podcast, so sign up and impress your boss. And don't forget as well, you can check out to see if you are eligible for a free Music Ally subscription. That link is also beneath the podcast. So that's it from me, Joe Sparrow. Until next time, farewell.